is a story about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, but the star of our story isn't him, or him, or her for that matter. Those stories have been done before. Our story is about the Secret Service and their secrets. And the star of our story is neither a hero nor a villain, just a guy who was caught up in tragic events. He was someone you've probably never heard of. This guy. His name was George W. Hickey, Jr. At the time of the assassination, Hickey was 4 months new to the Secret Service and already serving on the President's protective detail. Why the speedy promotion? 2 reasons. First, there was a shortage of manpower.
We had 11 agents who had left, and we had something like 16 agents off on advance assignments, which depleted the White House detail.
That left places that were being filled by brand new agents. They didn't have much protective experience. Now all these trips developed, and they had to send out the most experienced agents as advance agents. So the advance agents that did Florida were going to have to leapfrog over to help in Texas. So that meant that there was going to be a lot of inexperience on the detail with the president himself.
Second, we know that Kennedy, quote, cleared the way, end quote, for Hickey to join the Secret Service from the White House police, even though Hickey was 40 years old at the time and just past the age when one would have been accepted into the Secret Service under normal conditions, even given Hickey's veteran status as a Marine. Hickey was described by a fellow agent in the protective detail as having, quote, loved Kennedy probably more than he should have, end quote. There was obviously some sort of relationship between the two men. We're not entirely sure of their exact relationship, but we do know that Kennedy's paternal grandmother was Mary Augusta Hickey before she became a Kennedy. We also know that, as president, Kennedy arranged for Hickey and his family to receive a papal indulgence, something we don't think he would have done for just any member of the Secret Service. And before that, we know that Hickey gave Kennedy a rather unique gift, a gift that had to do with Kennedy's reputation as a war hero and his experiences as skipper of the PT-109 boat. After his PT-109 boat was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer, Kennedy's rescue of himself and his fellow sailors not only earned him a Navy Marine Corps Medal and a Purple Heart, it also cemented his reputation as a war hero, which didn't hurt his 1960 election to the presidency. Once, when asked how he became a war hero, Kennedy famously quipped, "It was involuntary. They sunk my boat." Kennedy used the story for a 1960 campaign spot featuring Henry Fonda.
Ever since I read an article in the Reader's Digest by John Hersey about a young naval officer in the Solomon Islands during some of the darkest days and nights of World War II.
The PT-109 movie came out the year of his assassination and starred Cliff Robertson as the intrepid hero. Kennedy called it a good product, and it certainly would not have hurt his campaign for a 1964 re-election. Kennedy ultimately achieved rescue of himself and his men by inscribing a message onto a coconut, which natives then carried to a friendly ally. So what was the gift Hickey gave to Kennedy? Somehow, Hickey was able to acquire the original coconut into which Kennedy had carved the message that rescued himself and the PT-109 crew. Some sources, especially connected to the movie, say it was an inauguration gift. Kennedy was so thrilled to receive the old rotting coconut that he had it encased in plastic and used it as a paperweight on his desk throughout his presidency. And since there seemed to be a relationship between the two men from before the inauguration, we think that JFK and George Hickey were at least marginally related. So what is Hickey doing in our story? As fellow Secret Service agent John Norris noted, quote, "Except for George Hickey and Clint Hill, many of the other agents just basically sat there with their thumbs up their butts while the president was gunned down in front of them." Clint Hill received a medal for his actions that day. George Hickey, who was singled out first as one of the two agents who took immediate action, who did not have his thumb up his butt, received no honors. Clint Hill ran to the back of the president's limousine, pushed Jackie back into the seat, and then covered the first couple with his body. But what did Hickey do? According to the official version of events, all he did was pick up the AR-15 rifle kept in the Secret Service follow-up car just as the car was leaving Dealey Plaza. At the same time, the other agents drew their revolvers. So why was Hickey singled out, named first as an agent who did not have his thumb up his butt? Before we get to that, let's introduce the rest of our cast, the other Secret Service agents in the motorcade. In the lead car were Secret Service Special Agent Winston Lawson and Special Agent in charge of the Dallas office, Forrest Sorrells. These men figure in our story mainly because they were involved in planning the motorcade route. Turns that required the motorcade to slow down any significant amount, say 90-degree turns and 120-degree turns, were against Secret Service protocols. At the very least, buildings around such turns were supposed to be secured. These buildings weren't. But rules were made to be broken, protocols and regulations were made to be ignored. After all, the motorcade route had been used before, and alternative routes would have required the motorcade to either jump a curb or travel through the broken bottle section of town, which would not have played well for political photographs. The route with the 90-degree and 120-degree turns was approved, even though there wasn't enough manpower to secure the buildings. Lawson testified that he usually asked the police to watch all the windows in a motorcade, but in this particular instance couldn't swear to whether he had actually done that. There were two Secret Service agents in the limousine with the president. One was the driver, William, or Bill, Greer. Greer had had no training in evasive driving. Some researchers think that had Greer taken evasive action, Kennedy might have been spared. On the passenger side of the front seat was the assistant special agent in charge of the White House detail, Roy Kellerman, who commanded the protective detail that day, since the chief head guy, Gerald Blaine, was not in Dallas. Kellerman directed events at Parkland Hospital and confiscated most of the autopsy materials before they could leave the morgue. The limousine passengers were Governor and Mrs. Connolly, and of course, President and Mrs. Kennedy. Governor Connolly was a victim of the assassination, having suffered a number of wounds, apparently from the same bullet. In the Secret Service follow-up car, immediately behind the president's limousine, usually with only about 5 feet of space between the two vehicles, there were 8 Secret Service agents. In the front seat, there was the driver, Sam Kinney, who was reportedly a good friend of George Hickey. Again, we note the poor training that driver agents received. Kinney reportedly veered to the right about the time of the explosive headshot to avoid running over Clint Hill. More on that later. Also in the front was Assistant Special Agent in charge, Emory Roberts. Roberts was next in command after Roy Kellerman and was in immediate command of the agents in the follow-up car. Roberts did two things of note. He ordered Jack Reddy back to the follow-up car, and he told George Hickey to be careful with the AR-15. On the driver's side running board, we had Clint Hill, who was assigned to protect Jackie Kennedy, and who, as we already noted, received a medal for his actions. We think the medal was well deserved, even if we have some other criticisms of Clint Hill. Behind Clint Hill was William, or Tim, McIntyre, who was assigned to protect President Kennedy. Meh, he really didn't do much that day. On the passenger side running board, there was John, or Jack, Reddy, who was also assigned to protect President Kennedy. Reddy apparently started to run to the back of the limousine after Hill did, but was called back to the follow-up car by Emory Roberts. That was probably a good thing, since driver Sam Kinney had to veer to the right to avoid hitting Clint Hill. If Reddy had also run to the president's car, Kinney might have hit Reddy with the car. The fact that Kinney veered to the right may be important later because it put the follow-up car that much closer to the curb on the north side of Elm Street at the time of the explosive headshot. Behind Reddy on the running board was Paul Landis. And what Landis did during the assassination was nothing. That leaves two more agents in the follow-up car, both on the rear seat. The first was Glenn Bennett, who was seated next to Landis, but on the inside of the car. What Bennett did during the assassination was reach for the AR-15, but that gun had already been picked up by George Hickey. George Hickey, who is turned completely to the rear in this photograph, while the other agents appear to be still in the process of turning. So, 8 agents in the follow-up car. That leaves the 2 Kennedy aides who were on the jump seats in the middle, Kenneth O'Donnell, who was seated behind the driver, Sam Kinney, and Dave Powers, who was seated on the passenger side behind Emory Roberts. Behind Kennedy's Secret Service follow-up car was the Vice President's limousine, Lyndon Johnson's car. There was one Secret Service agent in the car with Johnson, Rufus Youngblood. Youngblood reportedly jumped on top of Lyndon Johnson to shield Johnson with his body. He went to his grave with the reputation of being a hero. But there was some dispute about what Youngblood did or didn't do during the assassination. Youngblood said he couldn't remember climbing on top of Johnson to shield him with his body, although Johnson said he did. We think there may be some dissemblance there, that he didn't remember doing it because he didn't do it. Because here's what Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was in the car with Johnson and Youngblood, had to say. "Let me tell you one thing that didn't happen. That cock and bull story Johnson told about young blood pushing him down and jumping over and sitting on him, it's just plain a fabrication. It didn't happen at all. Youngblood turned around. He had a little box, I guess it was an information box from the radio, and he leaned over. See, we had a small car. You couldn't have pushed big old Lyndon down there. So Youngblood leaned over and looked right in Johnson's eyes, and Johnson looked straight ahead and didn't look at anything." So there's that. Then there were the agents in Lyndon Johnson's follow-up car, of which there were 3. Jerry Kivett, riding next to the passenger door in the front seat, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Thomas Lem Johns, riding behind Kivett, and Warren Taylor, riding behind the driver in the rear seat. Warren Taylor reportedly started to exit the car, but immediately got back in. We think he exited completely, albeit just long enough to run up the knoll and back down again. But that's a story for later. Lem Johns exited the car and reportedly stayed in Dealey Plaza for only a matter of seconds, until he could catch a ride to Parkland Hospital with some newsmen. We think it was longer than seconds, maybe as much as 15 or 20 minutes, but we'll save the specifics for later. Then there were agents who were not even in the motorcade, such as the head of the Kennedy detail, Special Agent in Charge Gerald Blaine, who wasn't in Dallas that day, but nonetheless wrote a book about the assassination. His co-author, Lisa McCubbin, had this to say about what they wanted to do with the book.
Well, and you asked the question, what do we want to do with this book? First and foremost, what Jerry just said was the most important point. But for me, I just felt it was a heartbreaking and heartwarming story of people. They were a band of brothers. And they've all said to me that all of these guys, it was a very small group of men, and they spent more time with each other and with the Kennedy family than they did with their own families. They ate together, they slept together, they played together, worked together, and they were a band of brothers. And to me, that was a very important point to get in the book.
Even Clint Hill described this band of brothers.
What did you love so much about being a Secret Service agent?
Well, it's the camaraderie with the other agents was very important, and it was like a group of brothers, a band of brothers that we worked with.
But there was one brother who was not in the band. Abraham Bolden was the first African-American Secret Service agent to be assigned to the Presidential Protective Division at Kennedy's request. Bolden had apparently won 2 commendations for cracking counterfeiting rings. But Bolden didn't last very long in his new assignment. When he complained to then Secret Service Chief Bauman about misbehaviors he saw in the other agents, he was reassigned, transferred out of the protective detail.
Of course, in 16 and 17-hour days, the tensions kind of build up. So we relied on each other to kind of break the tension, to tell jokes, and the camaraderie was, we were all brothers, and we depended upon each other. They don't use the term much anymore, but it really was a blackball system. If an individual came on for temporary duty and we felt the individual could not hold up under a certain circumstance or couldn't have your back, then they were rejected.
Bolden asserts that he tried to contact the Warren Commission to tell them about Secret Service misbehaviors he saw while on the president's protective detail, especially heavy drinking. But before he could, he was arrested on what apparently were trumped-up charges. He was accused of trying to sell a government file to a counterfeiter, although he had not actually received any of the money he was accused of soliciting. Bolden insisted that he was innocent, that he was being framed. He gave piano recitals featuring his own compositions to raise money for his defense. Secret Service Chief Rowley testified to the Warren Commission that Bolden had made no complaints to him, but Bolden said his complaints had been made to Chief Baumann, Rowley's predecessor as head of the Secret Service, who was never called. Warren Commission Chief Counsel J. Lee Rankin said that the commission had asked the FBI to look into the matter, but that Bolden's attorney refused to talk with them. It took 2 trials to convict Bolden. At the first trial, one jury member refused to vote guilty, and so a mistrial was declared. At Bolden's second trial, under the same not-so-impartial judge from the first trial, who had told the first jury that Bolden was guilty, Bolden was finally found guilty and sentenced to 6 years in prison. The primary witness against Bolden, a counterfeiter, later admitted, under oath, that he had previously committed perjury and lied about some parts of his testimony in Bolden's trial. But Bolden's appeal for a new trial was denied. One Secret Service agent testified at Bolden's trial that the counterfeiter Bolden was supposedly helping had called him and complained that the government was trying to entrap him. And this is what another fellow Secret Service agent, Joseph Noonan, told the House Select Committee on Assassinations about Abraham Bolden, essentially saying that Bolden didn't even have access to the files he was accused of stealing, and that the Secret Service had turned the girlfriend of the counterfeiter, who was the primary witness against Bolden, the one who had committed perjury during Bolden's trial, and the girlfriend had set Bolden up. Throughout his life, Bolden has consistently maintained his innocence and asserted that he was framed because he wanted to tell the Warren Commission about the heavy drinking by Kennedy's protective agents. We think there may be more to it than that. What Bolden said about his experiences in the Kennedy detail was quite interesting. Bolden had 3 main complaints. One was racism by other members of the Secret Service. Another complaint was about the lack of appropriate training. Bolden describes being handed an AR-15, which he had never before used. When he complained to the agent in charge that he'd had no training on the weapon, he was told to, quote, fake it. Bolden wasn't the only Secret Service agent who was handed a weapon without proper training. Secret Service agent Larry D. Newman told author Ronald Kessler something similar. On my second day on the job as an agent, they put me in the rear seat of the president's limousine. A supervisor on the detail placed a Thompson submachine gun on my lap. I had never seen a Thompson, much less used one. This account by one of Kennedy's protective agents of being handed a weapon he had never used before, had never been trained on, had never even seen before, to use in a protective situation corroborates Bolden's account, and it certainly brings into question the minimal training of the Secret Service agents back in the early 1960s. It is certainly consistent with the lack of evasive driving training that Greer and other drivers received. Our guy, George Hickey, here's his training certificate. Notice the date, April 15th, 1966, 2.5 years after the assassination. Gerald Blaine described quarterly practice with firearms, including the AR-15. At the time of the assassination, George Hickey was 4 months new to the Secret Service. He may have had one practice with the AR-15, if that. The guy who literally wrote the book on the Secret Service, Ronald Kessler, described frequent corner cutting in the areas of training and following protocols, such as the lapses that allowed a pair of well-dressed but uninvited party crashers to attend a state dinner. And practice situations, such as in this photograph, are a far cry from unpredictable real-life situations. What if there are innocent bystanders between the agents and their target? What if the car stops suddenly? Is shooting from a moving car really such a good idea? And then there was the complaint for which Bolden believed that he had been framed: heavy drinking among the members of Kennedy's protective detail. Bolden wasn't alone in accusing Secret Service agents of drinking. A couple of weeks after the assassination, Washington-based syndicated columnist Drew Pearson wrote an expose article about Secret Service men who were out drinking on the night before and morning of the assassination. An article that caused some bad publicity for the Secret Service. Pearson's article, published in numerous newspapers across the country, pointed out that at least 6 Secret Service agents had been seen drinking in Fort Worth on the night before the assassination. Here's the article that was buried in the Warren Commission documents. Apparently, they couldn't find a more legible copy. There were 2 Fort Worth locations of interest. The first was a bar called the Press Club, where agents stayed until it closed. The agents then migrated to a place called the Cellar. Secret Service Chief Rowley testified to the Warren Commission that his agents told him that they were in search of food, not alcohol, and it was only after learning that the buffet was closed at the Press Club that they ordered drinks. Note that the agents who told Rowley this were not under oath, and that even after learning that there was no food, they stayed until the place closed rather than go in search of some place that did have food. Rowley described the Cellar to the Warren Commission as, quote, some kind of a beatnik place where someone gets up and recites or plays the guitar, end quote. He left out the main attraction. He also said that the Cellar did not have a liquor license and that it didn't serve alcohol, implying that therefore the agents could not have been drinking there. We'll get back to that in a minute. According to Rowley, 9 men were involved at the Press Club and 10 were involved at the Cellar. Rowley went on to answer that, yes, it was against regulations for agents to be drinking while on travel status, but they had been punished enough, and so no further consequences, other than losing their president, were imposed. Rowley's assertion that the Cellar didn't serve alcohol wasn't quite true. It was true that the Cellar didn't sell alcoholic beverages because the place did not have a liquor license, so alcohol wasn't on the menu. However, the Cellar had a reputation around Dallas for providing free alcohol to, among others, any law enforcement types. So even though the Cellar didn't actually sell alcohol, they often gave it away. Some of the agents admitted only that they had had fruit drinks at the Cellar. Jimmy Hill, a manager of the Cellar, said that the Secret Service agents were drinking pure Everclear, which was a popular spike for fruit drinks. Jimmy Hill also said that the agents were, quote, bombed. So who exactly from Kennedy's protective detail was involved in the drinking incident? Of the 8 agents in the follow-up car, 4 of them, Landis, Hill, Reddy, and Bennett, were involved. It was probably Hill's bravery that saved the agents from losing their jobs. But you know who was not out drinking the night before the assassination? George Hickey. He wasn't even in Fort Worth. He was already in Dallas, making sure the cars were ready for the next day's motorcade. And after that, he went straight to his hotel room for a good night's sleep. But not to worry, all the agents, quote, performed in an exemplary manner, end quote. And yet, a president was killed. There are some other interesting things in Rowley's testimony. Chief Justice Earl Warren, chairman of the commission that bore his name, hardly ever said anything during the hearings, if he was even there. But he asked Rowley about, quote, submachine guns in one of the cars, end quote. Rowley started to hedge and not answer for, quote, security reasons, end quote, but then said that the Secret Service didn't have machine guns now. The word now indicates that they had a machine gun or something like it in the past. And in fact, Rowley used the past tense when he said, quote, they had a weapon, a new weapon, end quote. In fact, they didn't have any machine guns at all in the motorcade. What they did have was the AR-15, which was such a brand new weapon that the civilian population had never seen one before. They described it as a, quote, machine gun or, quote, submachine gun. It was the weapon handled by George Hickey. After the AR-15 was removed from the Secret Service arsenal, as the past tense of its use implied, despite criticisms from other agencies, assault-style rifles were not included in the Secret Service arsenal from the assassination until very recently. Although the agency seemed perfectly happy to keep submachine guns and shotguns in their weaponry, both of which could potentially spray the wrong person. More recently, however, the Secret Service finally seems to have adopted an assault-style weapon, at least for their counter-snipers who are positioned on rooftops, not traveling with these weapons loaded and cocked in moving cars. On the morning of the assassination in Fort Worth, President Kennedy started his last day of work, a day that started out in high spirits, with the president cracking jokes.
I know now why everyone in Texas, Fort Worth, is so thin, having gotten up and down about 9 times. This is what you do every morning. 2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
We all know what happened next. Within about an hour after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder of police officer J.D. Tippit. However, it seemed to be assumed fairly quickly that Oswald had also killed the president. But in the couple of days after his arrest, Oswald didn't do much talking. And he didn't live long enough to do any talking later.
Being let out by Captain Fritz. There is the prisoner. There is Lee. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
With Oswald's murder came the speculation that there was a larger conspiracy behind the president's murder.
You just learned from City Hall from a very authoritative source that police are working on the assumption that there indeed is a connection between Jack Ruby and Lee Oswald, and that in some manner of speaking, Oswald's murder was to shut him up.
But the same day as Oswald's murder, before any real investigation had been carried out, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover made a phone call in which he said, quote, "The thing that I am concerned about, and so is Mr. Katzenbach, is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." End quote. Nicholas Katzenbach was a deputy attorney general within the Department of Justice, whom Johnson later appointed to be attorney general. The next day, Katzenbach echoed J. Edgar Hoover's sentiments in a memo to the White House. Quote, "The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have any Confederates who are still at large, and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial." End quote. Again, nobody really had any idea whether Oswald had any Confederates, or whether he had been killed in order to silence him. No real investigation had yet been done. But this memo urged the appointment of a presidential commission to review and examine the FBI's evidence. And if the FBI conclusions differed from what the Dallas police had said, well, then the FBI's reputation would carry the day. But Hoover and Katzenbach were both assuming a foregone conclusion, that Oswald was the real assassin, the only assassin. The real problem was to convince the public of that. And so, the newly sworn-in President Johnson established a commission to investigate the death of his predecessor, the President's Commission on the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, and more commonly known as the Warren Commission. And sure enough, the conclusions of the Warren Commission were that Oswald was the real assassin, and that Oswald did not have any Confederates who were still at large. Could Hoover and Katzenbach have known something before the Warren Commission investigation was even started? The commission decided that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots at Kennedy's limousine from behind from the Texas School Book Depository 6th floor window. 3 shots matching the 3 empty hulls that were found on the floor. 3 shots, and only 3 shots. But there was something deeply unsatisfying about the Warren Commission's conclusions. For one thing, when a reporter asked Chief Justice Warren whether all the testimony would be released, Warren said, quote, "Yes, there will come a time, but it might not be in your lifetime. I am not referring to anything especially, but there might be something that would involve security. This would be preserved, but not made public." End quote. There's that word security again. Remember when Secret Service Chief James Rowley hedged on answering Warren's questions about the AR-15, quote, "for security reasons," end quote? Security, or national security, seemed to be the catchphrase in all matters involving JFK assassination secrecy. Some of the documents were set to be sealed for 75 years, long enough to be not in the lifetime of most, if not all, of those involved in the assassination, the Warren Commission, or the investigations. But thanks to public outcry sparked by the Oliver Stone JFK movie, many of those sealed documents were eventually released. Many, but not all. What is still being held back was supposed to be released on October 27, 2017. In the days before the scheduled release, Donald Trump said this.
On Saturday, Donald Trump announced an exciting new development. I will be allowing, as president, the long-blocked and classified JFK files to be opened. That's right. The documents will be released by the National Archives this Thursday, is what they want you to think.
But when the big release day arrived, Trump postponed the release of some of the files for 6 months, then postponed their release entirely for at least another 3 years, until after the next presidential election. Presumably, these are the most interesting of the documents he described as, quote, so interesting. In addition to the fact that some of the files have been suppressed and are still being suppressed, another problem with the Warren Commission's conclusions was their insistence that only 3 shots were fired. This insistence was probably because only 3 empty hulls were found in the Texas Schoolbook Depository, and that fact became public news shortly after the assassination. The Warren Report initially seemed to echo the FBI's version of events that Kennedy was wounded first, then Connally was wounded with the second shot, and then Kennedy was killed with the fatal headshot. In fact, the FBI has never changed that conclusion, which is apparently the same as the Secret Service conclusion, which persists to this day.
Let me just tell you 2 stories of where I felt mistakes were made. One, they did not call the driver of the follow-up car, whose responsibility is to stay within 4 feet of the presidential car. His eyes are on that car at all times. He saw all 3 bullets find their mark on the president, on John Connally, and then the fatal shot at the end.
But then the commission had a huge problem, because during its tenure, the media started reporting on a 3rd victim who was wounded during the assassination, a man named James Tague, because Tague's wounding meant that there was evidence of a shot that missed, and that meant the Warren Commission's 3-shot scenario had to be wrong. So how did the Warren Commission resolve this problem? And could they have been wrong? Find out in the next episode, Part 2, The Problems.